There's a particular kind of silence that settles over a life when everything is working, but nothing feels alive. You wake up in a comfortable bed, in a home you've worked years to afford. The mortgage is manageable, your children are doing well in school. Your career, though demanding, provides stability and respect. By every measurable standard, you've succeeded. Yet somewhere between the morning coffee and the evening news, you catch yourself staring at nothing, feeling nothing, wondering why none of it matters anymore. This isn't depression, though it might wear its face. This isn't a crisis, though it carries crisis weight. This is something Carl Jung spent decades trying to name, something he called the loss of soul. It's the peculiar tragedy of modern life, where we can have everything and feel empty, where success becomes a beautiful prison, where meaning quietly slips away while we're busy building the life we thought we wanted. You know this feeling, don't you? That growing sense that you're watching your own life from behind glass, that you're playing a role written by someone else, that somewhere along the way, the person you actually are got buried beneath the person you had to become. Jung discovered that this wasn't weakness or failure. It was something far more interesting, far more human, and far more universal than anyone wanted to admit. But here's what makes his discovery so powerful. He didn't just name the problem, he lived it. And what he found in his own darkness changed everything we understand about why life loses meaning, and more importantly, how meaning returns. So let me ask you directly, have you ever felt like you're living someone else's life? Because if you have, everything that follows might explain why. And if you haven't, stay with me, because Jung's insights reveal something about human nature that touches every single one of us, whether we've felt that void or not. The year is 1913, Zurich. A respected psychiatrist sits in his study as afternoon light filters through leaded glass windows. Carl Jung is 38 years old. He has a thriving practice, international recognition, a beautiful family, a lakeside home, everything a man could want. Yet he's writing in his journal with hands that occasionally tremble, describing sensations he can barely name. I felt as though I were in a land of the dead, he writes. Not metaphorically. Actually dead, though his body continued its routines. This is where our story truly begins, because Jung wasn't theorizing from comfort. He was drowning in his own affluence, suffocating in his own success, and desperate to understand why. What he discovered over the next several years, through his own descent into what he called his confrontation with the unconscious, would revolutionize how we understand the human psyche. But more than that, it would explain why so many people, especially in midlife, especially after achieving their goals, find themselves in that terrible silence where nothing's wrong, but everything feels empty. Jung called it the loss of soul, but he also gave it another name, the tyranny of the persona. Let me take you into that world, into the mechanics of how we lose ourselves, piece by piece, in the very act of becoming successful. Picture a man. Let's call him Michael, though he could be anyone. Michael is 52. He's a senior partner at a consulting firm. He wears Italian suits that fit perfectly. His handshake is firm, his laugh convincing, his eye contact appropriate. In meetings, he projects exactly the right blend of authority and approachability. At home, he's the dependable father, the steady husband, the man who remembers anniversaries and asks about his children's day. On Sunday mornings, you might see him jogging through his neighborhood, waving to neighbors, embodying health and discipline. Michael is, by every social measure, exactly who he should be. The persona he's constructed over 3 decades fits him like a second skin. Except it's not a second skin. It's the only skin anyone ever sees. And somewhere beneath it, something is screaming. Jung discovered that we all construct personas. We have to. The persona is the mask we wear to navigate social reality, to meet expectations, to be accepted, to survive. A child learns quickly what earns approval and what brings rejection. Gradually, systematically, we shape ourselves into acceptable forms. We learn to speak correctly, to control our impulses, to perform our roles. The persona isn't false, exactly. It's functional, it's necessary. But here's the danger Jung identified. The more successful the persona, the more completely it can eclipse everything underneath. Michael doesn't remember when he stopped painting, something he loved in college. He can't recall the exact moment he stopped reading poetry, or when his opinions became identical to his industry's consensus, or when he last felt genuine surprise at his own thoughts. These things didn't disappear dramatically. They faded quietly, deemed impractical, childish, irrelevant to the serious business of being a successful adult. What Jung realized, both in his patients and in himself, is that the persona demands sacrifice. Everything that doesn't fit must be pushed down, locked away, forgotten. Your anger, unprofessional. Your grief, keep it private. Your strange dreams, ignore them. Your desire to abandon everything and start over, ridiculous, irresponsible, impossible. So Michael goes to work. He performs his role flawlessly. He says the right things, makes the right decisions, maintains the right image. And every night, he comes home to that terrible silence, that growing emptiness, that sense of watching himself from a distance. His life is perfectly right and perfectly wrong at the same time. Nothing has failed, yet everything feels dead. This is the moment Jung warns us about. When the persona becomes too perfect, too complete, too successful at excluding everything else, the soul begins to starve. Not metaphorically, actually starve. Because the soul feeds on authenticity, on depth, on the full spectrum of human experience. And the perfected persona allows none of that. But here's what makes this so insidious. Michael can't even articulate what's wrong. How do you complain about success? How do you explain that having everything feels like nothing? How do you tell your wife, your children, your colleagues that you feel dead inside when, by all objective measures, you're more alive than ever? Jung knew this trap intimately because he lived it. A respected psychiatrist, successful by every metric, married to a woman from a prominent family, father to 5 children, living in comfort and recognition. And yet, in his late 30s, he began to feel that terrible disconnection, that sense of performing a life rather than living one. The persona he'd constructed so carefully had become a cage so subtle he almost didn't notice he was trapped. So he did something extraordinary. He descended, deliberately, consciously, into everything the persona had rejected, everything the successful Dr. Jung had to exclude to maintain his position. He entered what he would later call active imagination, allowing himself to engage with the parts of his psyche that proper society demanded he ignore. He played like a child. He built stone towers by the lake. He painted strange visions. He dialogued with inner figures that conventional psychiatry would have called hallucinations. His colleagues thought he was having a breakdown. Maybe he was. But Jung understood something crucial. The breakdown wasn't the disease. The perfectly maintained persona was the disease. The breakdown was the cure attempting to emerge, and deep in that descent, Jung encountered what he would name the shadow. Everything he wasn't supposed to be. Everything Michael isn't supposed to be. Everything you right now have learned to hide so completely you've almost forgotten it exists. But the shadow never forgets. It waits, it grows, it accumulates power in the darkness, and eventually it demands recognition. What happens when you ignore your shadow for decades? When you bury every unacceptable impulse, every forbidden desire, every aspect of yourself that doesn't fit the perfected persona? Jung discovered the answer in his own depths and in hundreds of patients who came to him with that same terrible emptiness, that same loss of meaning in lives that looked perfect from outside. The shadow doesn't disappear when you ignore it. It doesn't weaken, it transforms. It becomes what Jung called the dark double, operating beneath consciousness, influencing your choices in ways you don't recognize, creating the very emptiness you're trying to escape through ever more perfect performance of your persona. Michael doesn't know this, but his shadow has been speaking for years. It spoke when he felt inexplicable irritation at his son's creative career choice, because his own creativity had been buried. It spoke in his contempt for colleagues who seemed less disciplined because his own spontaneity had been condemned. It spoke in his attraction to younger women at work, not because he wanted to betray his wife, but because youth represented the aliveness he'd systematically killed in himself. It spoke in his Sunday morning jogs, where he pushed his 52-year-old body harder than necessary, punishing it for aging, for being human, for having limits his persona couldn't accept. Every addiction, Jung observed, is a shadow attempting to be recognized. Every inexplicable rage, every disproportionate fear, every compulsion that makes no rational sense. The shadow finds ways to emerge because it must. It's not evil, though it contains what we've labeled evil. It's not dangerous, though we've made it dangerous by rejection. It's simply the totality of everything we've excluded from our conscious identity, waiting in the dark, growing more desperate for acknowledgement. In traditional societies, Jung noted, cultures created rituals for the shadow. Carnivals where normal rules suspended, sacred spaces where the forbidden could be expressed, myths and stories where shadow figures played essential roles. Modern life, in its pursuit of perfection, in its worship of the flawless persona, has eliminated these channels. We've created a world where there's no acceptable place for the shadow, so it finds unacceptable places instead. Michael is sitting in his home office on a Tuesday evening. His wife is watching television downstairs. His children are grown and gone. He's staring at his computer screen, ostensibly reviewing quarterly reports, but actually frozen, feeling something rising in his chest that he can't name. It's not quite panic. It's not quite grief. It's the accumulated weight of 30 years of suppressed life trying to surface in one moment. This is what Jung called the return of the repressed. The shadow, denied and denied and denied, finally demanding its due. And when it comes, it doesn't come gently. It comes as crisis, as breakdown, as the mysterious illness that has no medical explanation, as the affair that shocks everyone, including the person having it, as the sudden, inexplicable decision to quit everything and disappear. The shadow, when finally acknowledged, often arrives as catastrophe because catastrophe is the only force strong enough to break through the perfected persona's defenses. But Jung discovered something that changes everything. The shadow doesn't have to arrive as catastrophe. It can be met. It can be engaged. It can be integrated. And when it is, when we turn toward rather than away from everything we've rejected in ourselves, something miraculous happens. The emptiness begins to fill, not with more success, not with better performance of the persona, but with actual life. Messy, complicated, contradictory, fully human life. He developed what he called active imagination, a practice of conscious engagement with the unconscious, not analysis, not interpretation, direct encounter. He would sit with paper and pen and ask the shadow to speak. He would allow images to arise without censoring them. He would dialogue with parts of himself that conventional wisdom said didn't exist or shouldn't be acknowledged. His journals from this period are extraordinary. Conversations with inner figures he named Philemon and Car. Strange, symbolic images that would later become the basis for his Red Book. Experiences that, if described to another psychiatrist, would have resulted in immediate hospitalization. Yet, Jung understood that this wasn't madness. This was the psyche's attempt to restore balance, to bring consciousness to what had been relegated to shadow, to integrate what had been split. For Michael, this moment arrives on an ordinary Wednesday. He's driving home from work. Traffic is light, the sun is setting, and suddenly, without warning, he begins to cry. Not sad tears, not happy tears, just tears pouring down his face while he drives, completely beyond his control or understanding. He pulls into his driveway, sits in his car in his garage, and cries for 20 minutes while his perfectly constructed life waits on the other side of the door. This is the crack, the moment when the persona can no longer hold, the instant when the shadow breaks through. And what happens next determines everything. He can suppress it again, medicate it away, return to performance. Or he can do what Jung did, turn toward it, acknowledge it, begin the long, difficult, essential work of integration. What does your shadow want to tell you? What part of yourself have you been exiling for so long that you've forgotten it exists? What would happen if, just for a moment, you let it speak? Jung called this next phase individuation, though the word barely captures what he meant. It's not about becoming an individual. We're already individuals. It's about becoming whole, about integrating all the parts we've scattered and hidden and denied, about moving from the tyranny of the persona toward what Jung called the self, capital S, the fullness of who we actually are beneath all the masks and performances and carefully constructed images. But here's what nobody tells you about individuation. It doesn't make life easier. It makes life real. And reality, Jung discovered, is far more complex, far more paradoxical, far more demanding than the simplified persona world we've been inhabiting. Michael is sitting across from a Jungian analyst 8 weeks after his breakdown in the garage. The office is quiet, book-lined, dimly lit by a desk lamp even though it's afternoon. The analyst, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and steady eyes, has just asked him a question that feels both simple and impossible. Who are you when nobody's watching? Michael opens his mouth to answer, ready to recite the familiar story, his accomplishments, his roles, his identity. But the analyst raises a hand gently. No, she says, not who you've become, who you are, who you were before you learned what you were supposed to be. The silence that follows is vast. Michael realizes, sitting in that dim office, that he has no answer. He's 52 years old, and he doesn't know who he is. He knows who he performs. He knows his resume, his responsibilities, his reputation. But underneath all that, nothing, or worse than nothing, a void that terrifies him to approach. This is where Jung's concept of the self emerges, and it's nothing like what popular psychology has made it. The self isn't the ego's wishful thinking. It isn't authentic self in the self-help sense. The self, in Jung's vision, is the totality of the psyche, conscious and unconscious, persona and shadow, everything we are and everything we've rejected, organized around a center that transcends ego consciousness. Jung discovered this through his own descent. After confronting his shadow, after allowing the repressed material to surface, he began to notice something extraordinary. The chaos started organizing itself. Symbols appeared in his dreams and visions that seemed to come from beyond his personal history. Mandala images that he would later learn represented wholeness across cultures. A sense of being guided by something larger than ego, larger than persona, larger even than personal unconscious. He called this the process of individuation, the psyche's natural movement toward wholeness, when we stop interfering with it through one-sided consciousness. It's not something we do. It's something that happens through us when we create the conditions for it. When we stop identifying completely with our persona, when we acknowledge our shadow, when we pay attention to dreams, to synchronicities, to the quiet voice of intuition that the rational mind has learned to ignore. For Michael, this begins with small rebellions. He starts leaving work at 5 instead of 7, ignoring the silent judgment of colleagues. He takes up sketching again, something he hasn't done since college, filling notebooks with drawings that embarrass him because they're so clearly amateur. He begins paying attention to his dreams, writing them down each morning, not interpreting them, but simply acknowledging them, giving them space. These seem like minor changes, but Jung understood that they're revolutionary. Each small act of honoring something the persona would reject is an act of integration. Each time Michael chooses authenticity over performance, even in tiny ways, he's building a bridge between conscious ego and the greater self. But individuation isn't smooth. It's not linear. Just as Michael starts feeling more alive, more present, he hits resistance. His wife notices the changes and doesn't like them. The man who was predictable is becoming unpredictable. The husband who always agreed is starting to say no. She accuses him of having an affair, which he isn't, but he understands why she might think so. The person she married is changing, dying in some way, and someone else is emerging. Someone more real, but less comfortable. This is what Jung meant when he said, individuation requires sacrifice, not the sacrifice of persona for shadow, but the sacrifice of one-sidedness for wholeness. Michael has to learn to be both the responsible professional and the creative dreamer, both the dependable husband and the individual with his own depths, both the persona he's constructed and the shadow he's denied, not choosing one over the other, but finding a way to hold the tension between them. Jung called this holding the opposites, and he believed it was the essential psychological task of the second half of life. In the first half, we build the ego, construct the persona, establish ourselves in the world. This is necessary. But in the second half, if we're fortunate, we begin the work of wholeness, which requires everything the first half excluded. The tension is excruciating. Michael feels pulled apart. Some days he wants to quit his job, sell everything, move to another country and start over. Other days he clings to his old routines, terrified of change. Neither extreme is the answer. The answer, as Jung lived and taught, is in the tension itself, in learning to contain the contradictions without resolving them prematurely, without choosing one side at the expense of the other. One night, Michael has a dream. He's in a house that's somehow both his childhood home and his current house. There's a door he's never noticed before, leading to a basement he didn't know existed. He opens it and descends into darkness. At the bottom, there's a room filled with things he thought he'd lost. His old paintings, books he loved in college, even toys from childhood. But there's also frightening things, shadows moving at the edges of vision, sounds he doesn't recognize. When he tells this dream to his analyst, she smiles. The self is showing itself, she says. Not as something out there to achieve, but as something down there to discover. Everything you've rejected isn't gone. It's just been waiting in the basement of consciousness. And the self wants it all, Michael. The beautiful and the terrifying. The acceptable and the forbidden, everything. This is what Jung meant by individuation leading to the self. The self doesn't exclude, it includes. It's large enough to contain all the contradictions, all the opposites, all the fragments we've scattered in our journey to become acceptable. But accessing it requires descending into what we've hidden, acknowledging what we've denied, integrating what we've split off. For Michael, and for everyone on this journey, the question becomes, can you love yourself enough to include all of yourself? Can you be whole rather than perfect? Can you live from the self rather than the persona? Because here's what Jung discovered and what Michael is beginning to learn. Meaning doesn't return when life gets better. Meaning returns when life gets realer. When we stop performing and start being. When we stop hiding and start integrating. When we move from the narrow security of the persona toward the vast, uncertain, absolutely alive territory of the self. So now I'm curious, what's waiting in your basement? What have you locked away that's asking to return? What would wholeness look like if you were brave enough to stop being perfect? Thank you for staying with me this far. What we've explored about persona, shadow, and the self is profound. But here's the truth. Jung spent his life proving. Understanding these concepts intellectually changes nothing. It's the practice, the daily work of integration that transforms everything. And the best, the most practical, the most powerful part of Jung's legacy is still ahead. Because now we move from theory to practice, from understanding to action, from knowing why meaning was lost to discovering exactly how meaning returns. 6 months after his garage breakdown, Michael is different. Not transformed in some dramatic Hollywood way. Different in subtle ways that matter more. He still goes to work, still wears the suits, still performs his professional role. But something has shifted underneath. The persona is still there, but it's no longer the only thing. It's become what Jung intended it to be. A functional mask that can be put on and taken off, rather than a prison that contains the entire self. He's learned to work with his dreams, not as puzzles to solve, but as messages from the unconscious. Each morning, before the day's demands take over, he sits with coffee and notebook, recording whatever fragments he remembers. Not interpreting, not analyzing, just witnessing. And slowly, patterns emerge. Recurring symbols, consistent themes, a sense of conversation with something deeper than ego. This is one of Jung's most practical gifts. The understanding that dreams aren't random neural firing, but purposeful communications from the unconscious psyche. They show us what we're avoiding. They compensate for one-sided consciousness. They warn us when we're too identified with persona. They introduce us to shadow material we're not ready to face directly. They guide the individuation process with wisdom that transcends ego understanding. Michael dreams of water repeatedly. At first, drowning dreams that wake him in panic. Then dreams of standing at the edge of oceans, lakes, rivers. Eventually, dreams of swimming, of being held by water rather than threatened by it. His analyst explains that water, in Jung's symbolic system, often represents the unconscious. Michael's dreams are showing his changing relationship with depths he spent decades avoiding. From terror to curiosity to trust. But dreams are only one practice. Jung developed others. born from his own confrontation with the unconscious. Active imagination, where you dialogue consciously with unconscious contents. Not meditation, where you empty the mind. Not prayer, where you speak to something external. Active imagination is direct engagement with the psyche's autonomous contents, treating them as real presences with their own intelligence. Michael tries this one afternoon when his wife is out. He sits in his study with pen and paper. He closes his eyes and asks his shadow to speak. At first, nothing. He feels ridiculous, but he persists. "What do you want?" he writes. And then, not thinking, just letting his hand move, words appear. "I want to live before we die." The simplicity shocks him. Not grandiose demands, not destructive impulses. Just this, the desire to actually live the years remaining. And once the shadow begins speaking, it doesn't stop. Page after page of wants, fears, longings that the persona never allowed. Not one of them evil or shameful. Just human. Just real. Just the full spectrum of being alive that 52 years of persona building had required him to suppress. This is what Jung meant by integration. Not eliminating the shadow, not perfecting the persona, but bringing consciousness to everything that's been unconscious. Acknowledging it, giving it voice. Finding appropriate channels for energies that have been dammed up for decades. Michael takes up painting again. Not amateur sketches, but committed practice. He joins a men's group at his analyst's suggestion. Not a success networking group, but men doing inner work, sharing shadows, supporting each other's individuation. He starts saying no to obligations that drain him. He schedules time for solitude, something the old Michael would have called selfish. He begins, gradually, carefully, to live from center rather than surface. His relationship with his wife improves, paradoxically, as he becomes less compliant. Real disagreements emerge, which lead to real conversations, which lead to real intimacy they hadn't experienced in years. She was mourning the loss of his predictability. But what emerges instead is actual relationship with an actual person, not a persona's performance of husband. At work, something surprising happens. As Michael becomes more authentic, more integrated, more willing to speak from depth rather than professional polish, he becomes more effective. Not despite dropping some of the persona, but because of it. His clients sense they're dealing with a real person, not just a consultant's mask. His insights become sharper because he's accessing intuition the overly rational persona had blocked. Jung was right. Wholeness doesn't diminish capability. It enhances it. But the most profound change is internal. That terrible silence, that loss of meaning that brought Michael to crisis, begins to fill with something he'd almost forgotten. Interest. Curiosity. Engagement with life, not as duty but as genuine experience. He finds himself noticing things again. The way morning light hits his kitchen counter, the specific quality of his wife's laugh, the satisfaction of completing a painting, however imperfect. These aren't grand revelations. They're the 1,000 small alivenesses that the persona-identified life had rendered invisible. This is how meaning returns, Jung discovered. Not through achieving more, not through external success, not through finding the right philosophy or belief system. Meaning returns through the integrated life, the whole life, the life that includes rather than excludes, that descends into depth rather than escaping into performance. Jung developed specific practices for this work, gathered from his own experience and decades of clinical practice. Beyond dream work and active imagination, he emphasized what he called the transcendent function, the psyche's ability to create new symbols, new meanings, new ways of being when we hold the tension between opposites long enough. He taught the importance of ritual, not religious ritual necessarily, but personal practices that honor the unconscious. Walks in nature with attention, creative work without judgment, solitude without distraction. Simple acts that create space for the self to emerge from behind the persona's noise. He stressed the value of synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that seem to connect inner and outer reality. Michael experiences this when he decides to read Jung's memoirs and discovers, the same afternoon, a used copy at a bookstore he's passing. Small thing, maybe. Or maybe the universe's way of confirming he's on the right path. Jung would say both are true. It's chance, and it's meaningful. The self works through synchronicity to guide individuation. Most importantly, Jung emphasized patience. Individuation isn't a project with a completion date. It's the work of a lifetime, of many lifetimes perhaps. The psyche has its own timing, its own wisdom about when material can surface and when it needs to remain unconscious a while longer. The ego wants to control and accelerate. The self requires surrender and trust. Michael is learning this. Some days he feels integrated and whole. Other days the old patterns return. The persona reasserts itself. He catches himself performing rather than being. But now he recognizes it. Now he can smile at it, this persistent habit of hiding, and gently return to center. The work isn't about perfection. It's about awareness. It's about choosing, moment by moment, day by day, wholeness over hiding. Jung wrote, late in his life, that the greatest tragedy wasn't that people suffered, but that they suffered meaninglessly. That they endured the pain of existence without the dignity of understanding why, without the possibility of transformation through consciousness. His life's work was to restore meaning to suffering by showing that crisis, breakdown, loss of soul aren't problems to solve, but processes to engage. They're invitations to depth, to wholeness, to the self that's been waiting beneath the persona all along. So here are Jung's practices, distilled to their essence. Record your dreams each morning. Don't interpret them, just notice them, stay with them, let them reveal themselves over time. Practice active imagination. Dialogue with your shadow, your inner figures, the parts of yourself that want to be heard. Give them pen and paper. Listen to what emerges. Create regular rituals that honor the unconscious. Daily walks, weekly solitude, monthly creative practice, whatever creates space for depth to surface. Notice synchronicities. Pay attention to meaningful coincidences. Let the universe speak its symbolic language to you. Hold the opposites. When you feel torn between contradictory impulses, resist the urge to choose one. Sit in the tension. Let the psyche create something new from the conflict. Work with an analyst or depth-oriented therapist who understands Jung's model. This work is nearly impossible alone. We need another consciousness to help us see what we're blind to. Be patient. Trust the psyche's timing. Know that individuation unfolds according to its own wisdom, not ego's agenda. And most importantly, stop trying to eliminate your shadow, perfect your persona, or achieve some imagined state of enlightenment. The goal is wholeness, not perfection. Wholeness includes the mess, the contradictions, the parts you'd rather not admit. That's what makes you real. That's where meaning lives. Michael is 53 now, a year since the garage breakdown. He's sitting in that same garage, same car, but everything is different. His life looks almost identical from the outside. Same job, same marriage, same house. But inside, where it matters, where meaning actually lives, everything has changed. He's not happy all the time. He's not blissed out. He still faces difficulties, still struggles with old patterns, but he's alive. Actually, undeniably, sometimes uncomfortably alive. And that aliveness, that sense of living from center rather than surface, that's what he'd lost and didn't know how to name. That's meaning, not happiness, not success, not the elimination of problems. Just this, the sense that you're actually living your life instead of performing someone else's, that you're whole instead of perfected, that you're real. What practices will you start today? Which of Jung's tools will you pick up first? Because understanding changes nothing. Practice changes everything. Carl Jung died in 1961 at 85 in his home in Küsnacht, Switzerland, overlooking the lake where he'd spent decades exploring the depths of human consciousness. In his final years, he wrote about how his own confrontation with the unconscious, that terrifying descent in his late 30s, had been the essential turning point of his life. Everything before it was preparation, everything after it was gift. He'd discovered something that would take the world decades to begin understanding. That the crisis of meaning, the loss of soul, the emptiness in the midst of success, wasn't pathology. It was initiation. It was the psyche's way of demanding growth beyond persona, depth beyond surface, wholeness beyond perfection. Jung lived what he taught. He continued painting, building stone structures, engaging with his dreams and visions, practicing active imagination until the end. His home became a kind of temple to individuation, filled with stone carvings, paintings, books from every spiritual tradition, spaces designed for reflection and descent. He created a life that honored both outer and inner, both persona and shadow, both ego and self. In his memoir, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, written in his 80s, he reflected on what mattered, not his achievements, though they were substantial, not his fame, though he'd influenced psychology, anthropology, religious studies, and culture broadly. What mattered, he wrote, was the integrity of my inner experience, the work of becoming whole, the courage to face what most people avoid, the willingness to value depth over success, authenticity over approval, soul over persona. Michael, at 53, doesn't know if he'll continue individuation for decades like Jung did, but he knows this. He's started something that can't be unstated. He's opened a door that can't be closed. He's tasted wholeness, and nothing less will ever satisfy him again. His work life continues. His marriage deepens. His children, now adults, comment that he seems more present, more real, more like an actual person than the somewhat distant father they remember from childhood. He's joined a Jung study group that meets monthly, reading and discussing the texts, supporting each other's inner work. He's developed a daily morning practice, coffee, dream journal, 20 minutes of silence, where he just listens to what's beneath the day's demands. Small things, ordinary practices. But Jung understood that transformation isn't dramatic. It's daily. It's the accumulation of small choices toward depth, toward authenticity, toward wholeness. Most people never even begin. They live and die identified with persona, never suspecting there's an entire inner universe waiting to be discovered. But you're not most people. You've stayed with this exploration this long. You've felt something resonate, some recognition of your own loss of meaning, your own perfect but empty life, your own shadow waiting to be acknowledged. That recognition is the beginning. That discomfort with mere performance is the crack where light enters, where the self begins calling you home. Jung would tell you, if he were sitting across from you now in that book-lined office in Zurich, that the path ahead isn't easy. Individuation requires courage. It requires facing what you've spent decades avoiding. It requires dying to who you thought you were to become who you actually are. It requires sacrificing the security of persona for the uncertainty of wholeness. But he'd also tell you, with the authority of someone who walked the entire journey, that it's worth it. That aliveness is worth the death of image. That meaning is worth the sacrifice of success measured externally. That being real is worth more than being admired. The choice before you is simple but not easy. You can return to performance, to the perfected persona, to the life that works but doesn't live. Many people do. The pull of the familiar, even when it's killing you, is incredibly strong. Or you can begin. You can write down your dream tomorrow morning. You can try active imagination this weekend. You can find a Jung-oriented analyst. You can say one authentic thing instead of the expected thing. You can let your shadow speak. You can start, today, the work of becoming whole. Jung called the psyche self-regulating. Given half a chance, given the smallest opening, it moves toward wholeness on its own. You don't have to know how. You don't have to understand the entire process. You just have to take the first step, then the next, trusting that something larger than ego is guiding, that the self knows the way even when you don't. Michael would tell you, if you asked him, that the hardest part was starting. That first dream journal entry felt ridiculous. That first session with his analyst terrified him. That first time he let his shadow speak in active imagination, he was certain he was losing his mind. But he did it anyway. And then he did it again. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, meaning returned. Not all at once. Not perfectly. But genuinely. Actually. In ways that changed everything while changing almost nothing visible. This is the paradox Jung lived and taught. The most radical transformation is invisible from outside. Michael's life looks the same. But Michael is completely different. The center has shifted. The identification has released. The persona is just a tool now, not a prison. The shadow is a companion, not an enemy. The self is being lived, not just theorized about. And meaning? Meaning isn't something you find or achieve or acquire. Meaning is what emerges when you stop living someone else's life and start living your own. When you include rather than exclude. When you descend rather than ascend. When you become whole rather than perfect. That's Jung's final gift. Not a solution. Not a method. Not a promise that everything will be okay. But something more valuable. A map of the territory, drawn by someone who traveled it completely, showing you that the loss of meaning isn't